Where does coincidence leave off and conspiracy begin?
This was no simple traffic accident.
RFK must die.
Grassy Knoll, people know what you're talking about.
The one conspiracy that I'm 99.9% certain about is the assassination of JFK.
This car is now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be only a matter of minutes before he arrives at the trademark. Something has happened in the motorcade route. Stand by, please. Several police officers are rushing up the hill at this time. Parkland Hospital has been advised to stand by for a severe gunshot wound.
President Kennedy has been assassinated. It's official now. The president is dead.
Dallas, the 22nd of November, 1963. 90 minutes after the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested on suspicion of the murder of a Dallas police officer. Less than 24 hours later, he was being accused of the murder of the president.
Did you kill the president?
No, I've not been charged with that. In fact, nobody has said that to me yet. The first thing I heard about it was when the newspaper reporters in the hall asked me that question.
But he never got to court. 2 days later, he was shot dead.
We don't know what Oswald might have known, and we don't know what he told police because they claim there was no record of anything he ever said.
The newly sworn-in President Johnson set up an investigation under Chief Justice Earl Warren to look into the assassination and the possibility of a wider conspiracy. 10 months later, the 26-volume report concluded Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone in assassinating the president. The Warren report was meant to be the final word on the assassination. It was not. 3 decades of speculation from conspiracy theorists has followed. JFK's autopsy raised further questions. Texas law meant the autopsy should have taken place in Dallas, but allegedly at Jackie Kennedy's request, it was done 6 hours later, more than 1,000 miles away, outside Washington.
The president should not have been moved until the autopsy had been completed. But emotions ran high and behavior ran amok.
And it was not just where the autopsy was done that raised questions, but how. In Dallas, doctors were convinced about the location of the exit wound of the fatal bullet.
Most of the medical people in Dallas said at the time that there was a big hole in the right rear of Kennedy's head.
But the autopsy in Washington showed the exit wound in the front of Kennedy's head. Conspiracy theorists questioned this and other findings.
They didn't even track a bullet that was in his back. They never determined where the bullets came from, how they traversed his body. This is arguably the most important autopsy of the 20th century.
It's one of the things that has allowed conspiracy theorists to go off and write 600-page books about the medical evidence of the president because it was poorly done.
Although the Washington findings have been confirmed by 3 separate medical panels since 1963, it hasn't stopped conspiracy theorists questioning the results. The autopsy showed that President Kennedy was shot twice, once in the back of the head with the exit wound at the front and once through his back. Governor Connolly, who sat in front of Kennedy in the limo, had 3 entry wounds in his back, wrist and thigh. So between the 2 men, 5 entry wounds. But key witnesses, 1 floor beneath the assassin in the book depository, heard the rifle being loaded and fired only 3 times.
Bang, click, click, flop.
1 shot struck President Kennedy in the head.
Bang, click, click, flop.
One that missed the car and struck a pavement.
The fragments cut a man on his cheek.
We know for a fact that second bullet missed.
Bang, click, click, flop.
The 3rd bullet must have done everything else.
Orland Specter, who is now a senator in the United States, came up with what's called the magic bullet theory or the single bullet theory. He proposed that 1 bullet entered the president's back.
The bullet exited his throat
and entered Connolly
out his chest and through his wrist,
shattering the bone,
and lodged in his thigh.
The bullet that they said did all of these things, they also said rolled off a stretcher in Parkland Hospital, and it was in pristine condition.
And that is, ladies and gentlemen, the magic bullet.
Proponents of the lone gunman theory have spent the last 40 years trying to show how this is possible, but I think almost anyone's intuition tells you that it's just, the odds against it are so incredibly astronomical that it just couldn't have happened that way.
The lone gunman explanation also rests on Oswald's capability as a marksman.
Lee Oswald was a Marine, and he was trained to shoot a rifle similar to the one that was found on the 6th floor.
Oswald, according to his military records and according to everyone who knew him, was a lousy shot at best.
Oswald was a marksman in the Marine Corps, and he practiced with that rifle. He was familiar with its peculiarities.
Oh, that sounds good. He was a marksman. Yeah, but that's the lowest of 3 categories. There's marksman, and then there's sharpshooter, and then there's expert. And he just barely qualified as a marksman. So here's a guy with a cheap rifle with a misaligned scope who had a terrible history of being able to shoot, who was firing from 60 feet in the air through an intervening tree.
How about that tree in the way? The tree was in the way 20 years after the shooting. It was a smaller tree in 1963.
Some assassination researchers have suggested that President Kennedy was not the only one killed as part of a wider conspiracy. In the 3 years after the killing, there were 30 suspicious deaths linked to JFK's demise. One death linked to Kennedy's assassination has created its own conspiracies. The killing of Oswald by Jack Ruby 2 days after his arrest.
I mean, here you have the assassin, the alleged assassin of the president, rubbed out before any trial or any testimony or anything is said on the record by him or about him in official capacity.
What if he knew something? What if he figured it all out? What if he decided to really tell the truth instead of being, you know, a good trooper? So Jack Ruby was tagged to go into the basement and kill him.
Ruby, somebody who wants to be a player, a local nightclub owner in Dallas, who hangs out at the police headquarters, knows everybody, likes people in the press, wants to be somebody. This is his opportunity.
Speculation is still rife over who would or could have conspired to kill the president.
It's almost much easier to say those that haven't been named as being parties in the JFK assassination. But I've heard, of course, the typical suspects: CIA,
Mafia,
FBI,
pro-Castro,
anti-Castro groups,
The right wing,
the military,
the left wing,
KGB,
Texas oil people,
Richard Nixon,
Jackie shot him with a Derringer hidden in her glove,
Coca-Cola,
sort of a Freemason cult.
He's not really dead at all, that he's living on a Greek island purchased for them, you know, with Aristotle and NASA's money.
JFK revealed the secret of the flying saucers to Marilyn Monroe, and therefore he had to be murdered.
The assassination of JFK generated a conspiracy industry, as did many high-profile deaths in the 60s. The tragic decade came to a close with the death of Senator Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother, on his way to winning the Democratic nomination for president in 1968. Many thought he would follow his brother's footsteps all the way to the White House.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
Senator Kennedy has been shot. There's a hold of a man who apparently has fired the shot.
I don't think it was just a coincidence that Robert Kennedy was killed the very night that he had gotten the Democratic nomination in California, which pretty much cinched him for the national Democratic nomination, which would have meant they would have faced another Kennedy in the White House.
And Robert Kennedy had serious enemies. He was prosecuting members of the Mafia. He had serious enemies in the Ku Klux Klan and white racists in the South because he supported Martin Luther King. There could have been CIA rogues involved in this because they opposed Robert Kennedy and Jack Kennedy making a deal with Khrushchev not to go after Castro. And Robert Kennedy was opposed to the war in Vietnam.
I find that on assassinations, people don't tend to go as far afield if the assassin is caught at the scene of the crime.
A Palestinian immigrant was arrested at the scene with a .22 caliber revolver. On the 24th of May 1969, Sirhan was sentenced to death. 3 years later, when California abolished the death penalty, this was reduced to life imprisonment. Two conspiracy theories have dogged Robert Kennedy's assassination. One, there was a second gunman. Two, that Sirhan was under mind control.
Was there a second gun shooting in there that night? There was physical evidence that that was the case.
Sirhan's gun fired 8 bullets that night.
There were, according to the police department, 7 bullets found in the victims. There was an 8th bullet they say was lost in the ceiling above. That meant that if there was any evidence of additional bullets on the crime scene, 2 guns at least were fired.
They took photographs of the walls and the door jamb behind us. And in that door jamb, there were 2 bullet holes. Well, an FBI agent said that he saw those 2 holes and said they were bullet holes, and also gave an affidavit saying he saw bullets in those holes. So where did those 2 in the door jamb come from?
Senator Kennedy's autopsy showed the fatal bullet had entered through the back of his head and concluded the gun was shot from behind at nearly point-blank range.
Sirhan was in front. Witnesses placed him there. And so Sirhan was face to face with Kennedy. Kennedy was shot from the back, from the rear at an upward angle.
His revolver was about, on average, according to the witnesses, 3 feet away from Robert Kennedy. The autopsy findings established that the muzzle distance between the assailant's weapon and Robert Kennedy's body was either in direct physical contact or no more than 1 to 3 inches away.
Nobody ever saw the gun point blank up against his head. And there were 70 or 80 people in that room that night. Here again becomes another question of the physical evidence not supporting the one-gun theory.
We record these flashbulb memories in an instant in our mind, and then we talk to other witnesses, read books, read newspapers, and our accounts change. So I'm not going to base my entire understanding of what happened in the Bobby Kennedy assassination on an eyewitness who says, by the way, I'm sure it was 3 feet between the gun and who finally shot Bobby.
At Sirhan's trial, his lawyers entered a guilty plea. In an attempt to save him from the death sentence, they argued he was a paranoid schizophrenic. Evidence of where and how he pulled the trigger was not examined. After the trial, the LAPD closed the files and remained resolutely silent about the case, fueling the idea of a cover-up. Matters became no clearer when the files were eventually opened to the public in 1988.
The LAPD had incinerated 2,410 assassination-related photographs in a hospital incinerator in Los Angeles.
The ceiling tiles, which would help us now in a trajectory study, they're destroyed. The door frame where you have photographs of bullet entry, they also were destroyed. So that's hopeless. It's gone.
It's just too convenient that photographs of the assassination disappeared, never to be found again.
Okay, so there's still another chance of a trajectory study. Let's look at the clothing of the victims. Gone.
The LAPD has since claimed that the holes in the door jamb were not from bullets, that Kennedy was turning away from Sirhan and pushed towards his gun in the chaos of the pantry. And finally, the reason they destroyed the evidence was to create more storage space. For this program, they declined to comment. The most bizarre aspect of the senator's murder is that the assassin claims to have no memory of the event.
At trial, he was asked, "Did you shoot Robert Kennedy?" Answer, "I'm told I did, I must have, I have no memory of this." That's what he said in response to questions about having shot all the victims. No memory, I'm told I did, I must have. So he doesn't know what he was doing there, and yet he was there with a gun.
Incriminating notebooks were found at Sirhan's home containing the words "RFK must die," written over and over again. At the trial, psychiatric tests of Sirhan seemed to offer an explanation.
The chief psychiatrist, Bernard Diamond, came to the conclusion that the writings in the notebooks were written in an altered state, in a hypnotic state. But he concludes that Sirhan hypnotized himself.
But a possible accomplice to Sirhan was seen by several witnesses.
Well, the woman in the polka dot dress was with a man and had left the scene and fled, saying, "We killed Kennedy, we killed Kennedy." That's been reported by a number of people.
The LAPD claimed to have interviewed the mysterious woman and discounted her from its investigation. Conspiracy theorists argue she was the wrong woman in the wrong dress, and the real accomplice is still out there.
It would have been highly useful to people who were manipulating Sirhan to have somebody with him to trigger a post-hypnotic reaction in which he would lose consciousness and carry out instructions. That's the role that the woman in the polka dot dress could have played.
Sirhan was seen standing with a woman in the pantry by people before we came into the pantry area. Whether it was the woman in the polka dot dress or not, I don't know.
The basic theory is that there was a second gunman, someone who was the actual assassin, that Sirhan was there sort of under hypnosis to fire at Kennedy, but not necessarily to be the one who killed him, but to be the one who takes the fall for it. And he certainly did take the fall for it.
Sirhan has made several attempts to gain parole based on his claim that he remembers nothing. But 3 decades later, no serious candidates in a conspiracy to kill Robert Kennedy have emerged. Sirhan remains in prison. The assassinations of the 1960s continue to capture the imagination of conspiracy theorists to this day. No deaths since have had such a powerful impact until those of Princess Diana and Dodi Fayed in 1997.
This is BBC Television from London. A short while ago, Buckingham Palace confirmed the death of Diana, Princess of Wales.
The death of Princess Diana was sort of the first of the the instant conspiracy theories.
36,000 websites were created within months of her death. Now, of course, I haven't looked at all of them. I hope nobody has.
Within minutes, we were getting emails saying this MI5 did it, the royal family did it. It was a conspiracy.
After the princess's untimely death, as the world grieved and the paparazzi were vilified, the idea emerged on the internet that Diana was the victim of an assassination conspiracy.
She was going to marry this Muslim guy, and the royal family thought that was a bad thing. She was, getting too involved in Bosnia and too involved in the landmine issues and all this stuff, so she had to be snuffed out. There's been some weirder ones.
The tunnel being an ancient site of worship dedicated to the goddess Diana. Now this, of course, could be simple coincidence, but it was the 13th pillar that the car crashed into.
The internet allowed this propagation of conspiracy theories, most of which were complete errant nonsense, but nonetheless influenced public opinion, influenced the feeling that there was something a bit funny about the deaths.
No one expressed a belief in a conspiracy more forcibly than the father of Dodi, Mohammed Al-Fayed.
Today, in my search for the truth.
Our job was really not to engage in any conspiracy theory. We never do that, but to try and piece together the facts and the reasons why he may believe that this was no simple traffic accident.
People don't want to believe in a random occurrence resulting in something as major as the death of a goddess like Diana.
The black Mercedes crashed in the Pont d'Almar tunnel in central Paris, a place notorious for road accidents. What exactly happened remains unclear and has led to the belief that more sinister forces were involved in the princess's death. Then there's the Fiat Uno conspiracy. Forensic scientists matched paint scratchings on the Mercedes to a white Uno. Witnesses claim to have seen such a car leaving the tunnel. Conspiracy theorists suggest the car was part of an assassination plot to run the Mercedes off the road. The Uno has never been found.
If you were trying to murder Princess Diana and Dodi Fayed, surely you would think of a slightly more effective way than getting a battered old Fiat from the 1980s to try and nudge it off the road when it just happened to be going at high speed, driven by a drunk driver, halfway through an underpass in Paris.
In May 2000, James Adamson, a photographer who had followed Diana for years, was found dead. Suicide, said the inquest. Adamson happened to own a white Fiat Uno. Accusations followed.
The French authorities, they were suspicious about him. He had followed Diana. He had been one of the paparazzi on her trail. They found out he wasn't in Paris that night. It wasn't his Uno involved.
But even more importantly, he'd been using the white Fiat Uno as a garden dustbin for the previous 3 years.
Now the fact that he dies means, we have a mystery death. Just like the Kennedy assassination, he's mystery death number 1 of probably what will be a long list.
But to many, what happened that night in Paris has a sad but simple explanation.
The Princess of Wales and her friend Dodi Fayed died because their driver on that fateful night was under the influence of drink and lost control of the car on a difficult section of road.
Mr. Al-Fayed refused to accept this conclusion and had the security men who'd been with Dodi and Diana in Paris questioned.
The first person I tackled was Kes Wingfield, and he assured me that Henri Paul had not been drinking. He'd been with him for 2.5 hours in the Ritz before they actually left there. That sowed a seed of doubt.
Mr. Al-Fayed claims that the security video of Henri Paul arriving at the Ritz shows the supposedly drunken driver completely in control. But the post-mortem shows 20.7% carbon monoxide in Henri Paul's blood, an unusually high amount.
Bearing in mind that was the amount that was discovered at the time of post-mortem. At the time of the crash, it would have to be over 30%. Henri Paul would not have been able to walk, let alone drive.
According to the French doctors, it was probably because he was puffing away at these very strong little cigars before he died that he had, as it were, a shot of carbon monoxide that remained in his bloodstream.
Mr. Al-Fayed hired his own experts to study the toxicology report.
The possibility of contamination of the blood is a real one and must be seriously considered.
And drew his own conclusions.
The Henri Paul blood is not his blood. Again, the French intelligence changed the blood for somebody who was committed suicide, breathing carbon monoxide and completely drunk, right? They took his blood and said, this is Henri Paul blood. How can a driver walk and he have his in blood 27% carbon monoxide? You can't walk, you can't see, you're dead.
They took the blood sample twice from Henri Paul on 2 different days with different witnesses there, and the results came out almost exactly the same. That's not a bad test to at least indicate that that man, in fact, that night was intoxicated.
But the official conclusion that it was a simple drink-driving accident still fails to convince everyone. So what is it about famous deaths and conspiracy theories?
You name it. If it's a famous person, there's a conspiracy theory.
A conspiracy makes you feel as though the death was somehow more important.
And a drunk driving accident is not a big enough death for a goddess.
We look back and we see a handsome, smiling president that morning in Dallas with his beautiful wife next to him, and we wish things were different.
You know, whatever, you just look at it, and if it's not an act of God, it's a conspiracy.